Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, executive power. As the money runs out, the United States flirts with another politically motivated debt crisis. Will the president bypass Congress, and how will the global economy react? Also this week, Iran, with a new president speaking to the world. Can Iran convince the West its nuclear program is peaceful and thus relieve some of the pressure of sanctions? We're going to show you just what sanctions do and the trouble with enforcing them. And if climate change has a beneficial side, then maybe this is just it. We're in Canada's part of the Arctic, where the fishing industry is booming. Hello everyone, we're going to start this week with a number, a very big number at that, $1 trillion, because that is the budget deficit the United States has been running since President Barack Obama came to power. Imagine that amount of money. We're actually talking just slightly smaller than the entire Indian economy. And so the White House and Congress are gearing up for yet another battle over money. To be precise, approving the budget for the year beginning October 1st. There's also talk about raising the country's debt ceiling. Now, that may raise some alarm bells too, because the country came horribly close to a historic debt default back in 2011, something that led the credit ratings agency Standard & Poor's to strip the United States of its AAA rating. The White House has asked Congress to raise the $16.7 trillion debt ceiling, but Congress won't do that unless there are spending cuts and also some delays in Barack Obama's health care law, the one that they refer to as Obamacare. Now, if they fail to agree on October 17, the Treasury will be down to its last $30 billion. The United States won't be able to pay its bills. That could shut down government, schools, and Social Security payments. So it's serious, right? Well, so is the opposition to raising the debt ceiling, or rather raising it without something in return. Have a look at this now from Kimberly Halkett in Washington, D.C. The lengths that one Republican senator went to chop down the costs of Obamacare and save the United States some much-needed cash.
The Senate will be in order.
Senator Ted Cruz stood on the floor of the U.S. Senate continuously for 21 hours and 19 minutes. When he began his marathon speech, Cruz promised,
"I intend to speak in support of defunding Obamacare until I am no longer able to stand."
And he did, speaking out not just in opposition to President Obama's health care law, but also his love for a certain brand of fast food hamburgers and the movie Star Wars. Cruz even read passages from the children's Dr. Seuss book series.
Do you like green eggs and ham? I do not like them, Sam I Am. I do not like green eggs and ham.
But Cruz's demonstration is only symbolic. It did not qualify as a filibuster used to stop legislation. In fact, as soon as Cruz stopped speaking, the Senate took a procedural vote to begin its effort to stop the government shutdown. Senator Cruz was speaking against the proposed law because Democrats are stripping it of language that would deny funding for Obamacare. It's something that Cruz wants to see happen. So why did the senator bother to go without a bathroom break for almost a full day if nothing changes as a result of his efforts? Democrats say a handful of Tea Party Republicans in the Senate may run for president in 2016. And the legislative theatrics are designed to endear Cruz with potential voters.
There are some working to almost single-handedly force us into a shutdown. Because remember, a bad day for government is a good day for the Tea Party.
And marathon talking tactics make headlines, just the kind of publicity a politician needs to win an election, no matter how far off it might be.
So there is no doubt there are consequences to the quarrel over the debt ceiling. 2011 taught us that, when the markets dived more than 2,000 points and consumers slowed their spending. But as we also know, American issues go far beyond the eastern and western seaboards. And so here is the international impact and perspective now. With one of our regular contributors, Paul Donovan, who is a global economist at UBS Investment Bank. He's joining us from Dubai. And Paul, we've seen very, very starkly the effect that Fed decisions have. And most recently, it was that decision not to taper the stimulus program. It will have to be pulled back at some stage. So what do you think will be the impact, and when do you think it might happen?
So I think the Fed made a mistake in September. I think the failure to scale back bond buying was a policy error. Markets were ready, markets were prepared, and the Fed misstepped. Now, given that the Fed said, look, one of the reasons we're not doing this is because we've got fiscal uncertainty. That fiscal uncertainty is not going to be cleared up by the October meeting, so I think October is unlikely. In December, I think the Fed has got a problem. About 40% of retail sales take place in the 6 weeks before Christmas. You do not mess with Christmas in the United States. So I think the Fed's unlikely to change then. So I think we get the scaling back starting in January of next year. What is the impact of that? Well, the main impact of that, of course, is that I think bond yields in the States will start to rise a little further. We could be talking sort of around 3.5% 10-year yields by the mid to end of next year. That matters because bond yields are very highly correlated around the world. And if we see higher bond yields in the States, we'll see higher bond yields in Europe. We'll see more volatility in financial markets. And it's a higher bond borrowing cost that I think is going to be the main transmission mechanism of Fed policy to the rest of the world.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the rest of the world, actually, because that's where I wanted to go next. This decision not to taper it gives a bit of breathing room to some of the emerging markets, doesn't it, to sort themselves out, because they were seeing a potential negative impact from the end of the US stimulus. Now there is a reprieve, so what do they have to do to get themselves in order so that when the tapering does happen, they cope with it?
Well, I think what has happened is that as bond yields have started to rise, bond investors have rediscovered their power. And for the last 4 or 5 years, bond investors have been faced with a low-risk world, a low-interest rate world. They haven't had a lot of power. And what has happened is that a number of countries, including in emerging markets, have pursued policies that they would never normally be allowed to get away with. Too loose monetary policy, too loose fiscal policy, inappropriate credit policies. And what happened was, as the Fed was discussing scaling back its quantitative policy measures, bond yields rose, bond investors rediscovered their power, and they started punishing governments. As you say, they've now got a bit of breathing room until we actually see the Fed scaling back. And so I think now is the time to make restitution for past policy mistakes, to start looking at your fiscal policy, monetary policy, credit policy, and saying, actually, is this right? Or are bond investors going to punish us when yields start to rise? It's unfortunately a very short-term window of opportunity, and there's 4 or 5 years of bad policy decisions to try and correct. I think it's going to be a tough call, and I think emerging markets, or rather some emerging markets, remain quite vulnerable in that situation.
Paul, can I get a quick word from you on China? Your concerns, UBS's concerns about debt there, but and also generally just where it sits right now.
Well, I don't think China really has debt problems as such. China does have some debt, of course. It's got quite a lot of debt, but it owes it to itself. Debt is normally only a problem when you owe it outside of the country. But China is entering a very critical phase. We've got the third plenary session of the 18th Party Congress, which is coming up in November. What's that? Well, basically, that's the top 200 people in China getting together and deciding what policy is going to be in the economy. And there is a bit of a battle going on between conservative factions and reform-minded factions about how the economy should be shaping up. That's going to matter a great deal, not just to growth in 2014, but potentially to growth over the medium term. Not what is the growth rate, but what sort of growth does China have? Do we get more of the same infrastructure spending, commodity intensive, or do we get a more free market economy emerging over the next few years? What happens in November is going to be absolutely critical to determining the future path of China's growth.
And Europe, Paul, for a time on this program, I reckon we were discussing the problems in Europe pretty much every week. But I would say these days the Eurozone crisis is not as front page news as it was. Of course, there are still problems, though, and there've been elections across Europe. But where should we be looking in Europe right now?
Well, the good news in Europe is things can't possibly get any worse than they already have been. We've just had 6 quarters negative GDP and pretty much have hit the bottom. And so that means that the economic data is relatively speaking going to be improving. We're going to be looking for sort of low but positive growth in the Eurozone. The real problem, though, is the European banks, or rather the Eurozone banks specifically. They still are very, very weak. They've still got many problems. They're very reluctant to lend. They're pulling out of overseas operations, including, of course, pulling out of Asia and out of the Middle East, concentrating on the home markets. And we're going to end up with a scenario where I believe bank lending growth is going to be below normal. Now, here's the thing. In a modern capitalist economy, if bank lending growth is below normal, economic growth is below normal. If economic growth is below normal, you're not going to reduce unemployment significantly. And that, I think, is going to be the feature of the Eurozone, not just for the next 12 months, but probably for the next 3 or 4 years.
Paul Donovan from UBS. Pleasure as always. Thank you so much for joining us on Counting the Cost.
Thanks very much.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, we'll find out why fishermen in northern Canada are enjoying bigger catches than ever before. Well, it was a pretty busy week at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, with most of the attention on the newly elected Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani. He arrived at the UN eager to find a way to end the crippling economic sanctions the West's imposed on Iran to try to force it to stop the development of nuclear weapons. Have a look at this just quickly. It's estimated Iran's oil revenue has fallen by half. In 2011, it earned about $100 billion from oil. Inflation's been soaring, running about 39%. And billions of dollars have left the country, according to the Wall Street Journal. It could be an estimated $600 billion. Then you've got unemployment that's said to be around 12.9%. And only 32% of Iran's population was actually economically active in 2012. And that's Iran's own central bank saying that. And further sanctions signed into law could cut Iran's oil exports by another 1 million barrels per day over a year to near zero. They'd also penalise countries trading with Iran in other industrial sectors. So suffice to say, Iran wants to not only avoid new sanctions, but get rid of the old ones. And it looks like the idea of at least talking about that is getting closer. There was talk that President Rouhani and US President Barack Obama would meet on the sidelines of the General Assembly and shake hands. They didn't. But Secretary of State John Kerry did meet with Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. There does appear to be a real desire within Iran for some kind of normalization of relationships with the West. Now, in a moment, we're going to show you an interview with a prominent lawyer on how these sanctions work, things like that. But before that, just a little look at, well, a way to illustrate really how thorny this issue of sanctions can be and how far down into everyday life they can reach. This is from Kristen Salumi in New York.
It is 36 floors of prime Manhattan real estate and the largest asset ever seized by the U.S. government for alleged links to terrorism. While you might not guess it from the stores who rent space here, the office building on Fifth Avenue is, according to a federal judge, a front for the Iranian government. The U.S. Attorney's Office first filed suit against the building's co-owners in 2008, Asa Corporation and the Alavi Foundation. Alavi, a Persian charity, responded to the ruling with a statement on their website. We have reviewed the decision and disagree with the court's analysis of the facts and the law. The foundation was ready for trial and is disappointed that it didn't have the opportunity to rebut the government evidence before a jury. But the judge said it was indisputable that Alavi board members were involved in the creation of Asa Corporation as a front for Iran's national bank, Bank Melli, in 1989, and remained with the board after the sanctions aimed at curbing Iran's nuclear program took effect.
So that is Iran-US issues. The European Union ones too. It recently passed sanctions against Iranian companies, but there was a bit of a setback. That was one of the things I discussed earlier in the week with Khawar Qureshi, a lawyer and head of the McNair Chamber in London.
Sanctions have been in existence and operated since 432 BC in the Athenian era to try and prevent trade. Since then, the United Nations Charter, Article 41, allows sanctions to be imposed to maintain or restore international peace and security, economic sanctions. They were used with very limited effect in southern Rhodesia and in South Africa. Zoom forward, because in the interim, that was in the 60s and 70s, we had the Cold War, and it wasn't possible to get consensus in the Security Council. You need all permanent members, including now Russia, to adopt sanctions. 1990 was the next example, August 1990, economic sanctions against Iraq. Since then, we've had sanctions concerning jurisdictions such as Yugoslavia, but more significantly, of course, with Iran. The desire or the intended effect of economic sanctions, so far as the legal basis is concerned, is to promote or restore international peace and security.
So in this particular case which has just been ruled by the European, it's the General Court, isn't it?
Yes.
What's been their call on these particular sanctions being wrongly imposed?
We have to step back because the way in which sanctions developed through the United Nations, specifically in the aftermath of the events of September the 11th, a UN sanctions committee was established dealing with terrorism finance, terrorism sanctions. And there were many who said that the way in which the sanction committee operated was opaque at best. Any individual's name could be notified by any member state of the United Nations. The suggestion was that there was very little scrutiny. So somebody's name could then be circulated to all of the financial institutions all over the world, preventing them from engaging in any form of business, moving forwards, preventing them from having access to any economic assets. In 2010, in a case called Cardi, the European Court of Justice held that sanctions had to have an underpinning, constitutional underpinning. Because of the extreme interference with human rights, they had to be justifiable, which means that there had to be some evidential basis for these sanctions. But at the same time, in the United Kingdom, in a case called Ahmed, the first ever decision of the UK Supreme Court, the UK Supreme Court held that sanctions, terrorism sanctions, UN sanctions, had to be based upon evidence because of the extreme impact these sanctions had on individuals and entities.
So therefore, is the problem that we've got here is that these sanctions are ostensibly about stopping a nuclear program, which is neither confirmed nor denied, or there's no evidence, firm evidence about it?
Well, the evidence, so far as the General Court decision of the 6th of September 2013, which you're referring to, is concerned, which concluded that sanctions against 7 banks and 1 individual couldn't be sustained, but they were sustained against 2 other financial institutions. What the General Court held was that in those instances, those 7 institutions and that 1 individual, the evidential basis for linking those banks and that individual to the development of nuclear technology and or providing financial assistance, that evidential basis hadn't been made out. Whereas the 2 banks that sanctions were upheld in respect of, the General Court was satisfied those matters had been made out. There was a decision of the Supreme Court in England in a case called Bank Malat in Iran in July of this year, in which the UK Supreme Court also held that the basis upon which sanctions had been imposed in England on Bank Malat, one of the largest financial institutions in Iran, the basis that was stated didn't chime with the basis that ultimately was used to justify the imposition of sanctions.
So would you view this as a big victory for these banks and for these companies and individuals to have this reversed?
They obviously will take it as a victory for them, but what I see it as, more importantly, is the courts trying to maintain the rule of law. The ultimate objective of a court is to ensure that those who are applying the law do so in a fair manner. And what the General Court held and what the European Court held in Cardi is that law that interferes with rights to a very extreme extent has to have some justification. And those who are subject to sanctions need to have some evidential basis.
So there's no political moves here, you think? This is all just about keeping the law? Or
I sigh because, of course, I'm looking at it from my perspective. I'm concerned with the jurisdictions that I've identified, the UK Supreme Court and the general courts in Europe. I'd be very surprised if those institutions were affected by political considerations. Their jurisprudence is well-founded, as I explained. The approach of the English court goes back to 2010, and the approach of the European Court goes back to 2010, which is when the sanctions regime really took off.
How difficult or easy is it to actually police these sanctions in the first place and to make sure that they are targeted? Because what you don't want is everyday individuals getting hit as well in some sort of roundabout fashion.
This has always been a problem. After the events of September 11th in 2001, when the Sanctions Committee was established, there were allegations that certain vendettas were being settled by states, putting forward names, businesses were being destroyed because of internal politics. The Sanctions Committee has developed substantially since then. The objective of the Sanctions Committee is to try and provide more targeted measures for sanctions.
And have they been successful in your opinion? Have they actually done what they're supposed to and not hit other people?
These challenges, the cases that I mentioned, Cardi, Ahmed, the Bank Malak case, and the recent cases, which were before the General Court, are very important reminders to those who adopt and apply sanctions that there is a court that is capable of reviewing what they do. And hopefully that ensures that they try to strike a balance and that they make sure that there is an evidential basis for what they're doing.
We've been discussing mostly a European Union decision here. The fact is, Iranian sanctions, it's really the US that we talk about, isn't it? Is the US still driving this? Is it still the driving force when it comes to trying to lock down Iran in this way?
Well, the sanctions, imposition of sanctions from the US dates back to 1979, the storming of the US embassy. The US has been very active in seeking to enforce and police sanctions against regimes such as that in Iran and North Korea extraterritorially. Because so much finance involves going through New York and so many banks in the US have a presence in Europe and elsewhere, the US authorities have actually been able to investigate and impose significant financial penalties to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars on banks that the US has identified as violating sanctions concerning Iran, North Korea, and other states, because they've been able to exercise far more investigative oversight than perhaps authorities in mainland Europe.
Kawal Qureshi, pleasure as always. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're going to finish this week with a constant clash between environment and business. And we're actually going to the top of the world for this example. You've got your global warming, you've got the melting polar ice caps, and as a result, new marine species are moving north. Now, fishermen see that as an opportunity, start commercial fishing up there. But scientists are warning the effects could be disastrous. Here's our report from Daniel Lack in Canada's eastern Arctic.
Beneath the still, ice-free and warming waters of Cumberland Sound, more fish than ever before.
So we'll start loading some turbot from here.
A great first catch for Peter Killebuck on his new trawler's maiden voyage. Greenland halibut, known as turbot, are a species local Inuit just began to catch in recent years. Now a longer ice-free season is helping build a commercial fishery where once people fished only for food.
We went out to test our lines and also to test new fishing grounds in Cumberland Sound. And I'm glad to say that with the effort of everybody, we did catch quite a bit of turbot in a very small amount of time.
New machines at Pangnirtung's fish processing plant prepare turbot for export to East Asia. Bigger fishing boats catching more fish mean dozens of jobs in a place where most are unemployed or work for the government.
It kind of falls really well into a traditional lifestyle, and so if people are able to use some skills that they've always had and apply them to a job, then that's something that will probably be of more long-term benefit.
Projects like this newly built small craft harbor and this entire fishing pier show that the authorities here are taking the prospect of commercial fishing seriously. But there are those who warn that looking for opportunity in what is essentially a global climate crisis might be premature. Elsewhere in Canada's western Arctic and off Alaska, commercial fishing has been halted until scientists do more research on one of the least understood ecosystems on the planet, the polar seas.
I think that's a precautionary approach that's actually enshrined in international law, is when you don't understand a place, you study it before you start exploiting it. And that's what we should do.
But Canada has been cutting funding for Arctic research, and many of those who live in this harsh environment want to seize whatever opportunities arise from climate change, even as they confront its challenges. Daniel Lack, Al Jazeera, Pangnirtung.
And that is our show for this week, but there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/business. The latest business headlines are there, also all of our previous episodes for you to catch up on whenever you want. You can also get in touch, either tweet me at Kamal AJE, our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, or drop us an email. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.